in the back. Okay, here we go. You're very welcome to Tras na Tíre. Tonight we're going to be looking at Lieutenant General Joe McKelvey by Jim McVeigh, who's written a book on him. Upcoming talks this week. On Tuesday we got Charles J. Kickham and His People by John Birmingham. On Wednesday, Monastic Ireland by Dr. Therese Cullen. On Friday, The Belfast in the Summer of 1969 by Sean Murray. So just to let you know a little bit about Joe McKelvey and a little bit about the author and our guest here tonight. On the 8th of December 1922, Joe was executed by firing squad by Free State troops in Mountjoy Jail in Dublin, alongside Rory O'Connor, Lee Mellows and Richard Barrett. Their only guilt was that they opposed the treaty. Joe McKelvey, although born in Stewartstown, County Tyrone, grew up in Cyprus Street, Belfast, and was involved from an early age in the Republican movement, rising to command the 3rd Northern Division. Jim McVeigh is a trade union organiser with SIP2. He's a former city councillor and Sinn Féin group leader on Belfast City Council. He's also a former Republican prisoner who spent over 16 years in jail and was released under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. He's a keen interest in history and has written 2 books, first on the execution of Tom Williams in 1942 and the second on Joe McKelvey. Jim is also a founder member of the James Connolly Visitor Centre on the Falls Road, as you can tell by his t-shirt. Jim, you're very welcome here.
Yes, that's my work cup now.
Away you go.
Okay, well, Joe McKelvey. Joe McKelvey was lived in Cyprus Street just off the Falls Road, and I had grown up with a little knowledge of Joe McKelvey, but only a little knowledge, and I had always been interested in him. And he was executed, when he was executed in 1922, he was only 24 years of age. Right? And this is what Potter O'Donnell, another great Republican, socialist, trade unionist, writer, etc. This is how he described McKelvey. He spent time in Mountjoy with all of those lads who were executed on the 8th of December. And he was very close to Mellows in particular. But he knew McKelvey, and this is how he described him. Joe McKelvey was a Belfast man of Donegal stock. He was sturdy of build, of enormous strength and reckless courage. He was an unyielding opponent, but not a dangerous enemy, for he was quite incapable of deep hatreds. He was predestined to be a martyr in a revolutionary movement that failed, for he would not dodge and he could not bend. That's how O'Donnell described Joe McKelvey. He was a small guy, but quite a stocky, athletic type of character. And as I say, he was only 24 years of age when he was executed. And what I found sort of quite surprising about McKelvey was that nothing had really been written about McKelvey. And in many respects, he was the lost leader that hadn't really been recognized. When you look at the stories and the books that have been written about Liam Lynch, or indeed Liam Mellows, Ernie O'Malley, and now Seamus Robinson, for example, previously with Daniel Jack, etc. McKelvey had, up until the little book I had written, nothing had really been written of any significance about McKelvey. And hopefully, one of the things that struck me about that was that when McKelvey was executed, he was the OC of the Republican prisoners in Mountjoy prison. Yeah. Before his arrest in the Four Courts in Dublin, he was the Assistant Chief of Staff of the IRA. He was the Commandant of the Four Courts garrison during the occupation. Before that, he was the OC of the 3rd Northern Division of the IRA. And before that, he was the Belfast Brigade OC of the IRA. And he had been a battalion OC. He participated in some of the most significant military operations carried out by the IRA in the 6 counties and in Belfast and Lisburn in particular. During the course of the treaty discussions, the period in between the signing of the treaty and the split, McKelvey participated in many of the key meetings that took place between, on the one hand, Mulcahy and Collins, and on the other hand, on the anti-treaty side, the Republican side, Liam Mellows and Joe McKelvey. Joe McKelvey, if you read Liam Mellows and the Irish Revolution by C.D. Greaves, you will see McKelvey's name popping up at all of those key meetings. Yeah? And I often wonder why McKelvey, why was that? You know, why was he only mentioned but never really credited with any significant contribution? And I think there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, he was a Northerner, and there was the extent to which whenever Ernie O'Malley in his own book, he made a comment saying that he never really understood why McKelvey had been appointed Assistant Chief of Staff, or indeed the Commandant of the 4 Cork garrisons. I think that while I admire O'Malley's works, I think he didn't give McKelvey his due. He didn't understand McKelvey's history and his contribution to the struggle and what he did. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit. It's just that. So McKelvey was born, as you said, and he wasn't a Donegal man as O'Donnell tried to claim. His father was a Donegal man from Dukery in the Gaeltacht area of West Donegal, but McKelvey was born in Stewartstown. His mother was a postmistress in the town, and his father was an RAC officer. Right? Probably quite a common thing at the time. And I think he had been stationed in Stewartstown, Matter. They had obviously fell in love, married, and then once they were married, he had to move. It was one of the internal rules of the RAC at the time that you couldn't serve in your own county, right? So he ended up in Belfast, and he ended up being stationed in Springfield Road Barracks, which became a notorious RIC/RUC barracks, where some of the main characters who were involved in assassination of Republicans were stationed in Springfield Road Barracks, for example. So that's where the father was working. They eventually moved to Belfast, I think, in 1914. And from what I can gather, like a lot of people, it was defined work. Joe was the only son to Rose McKelvey and Patrick McKelvey. And they moved into a little terrace house in a working class street in the narrow streets of the Falls, in the shadow of the great mills of Belfast. So I think they moved for him to try and find a future for him. And he soon became involved, as many young people did at that time, in the Fianna Éireann in Belfast. He became involved in the Fianna. He got involved in the local GA club, which was the Potter Crowleys, named after a Cork Fenian. Quite a lot of Cork men up there at the time, up taking our jobs, you know. But and they set up the Crowleys, and the Fianna had effectively infiltrated a lot of the GA clubs as a strategy to recruit up Cork somebody. Yes, up Cork. And he then became as a founding member of O'Donovan Rossa GA club. So there's actually a strong Cork connection. A lot of Cork immigrants come up to work in Belfast and settle there and set up a lot of GA clubs, but particularly Crowleys and Rossa, which were two obviously famous Cork Fenians. And he was recruited into the Fianna. And I think by 1917 he had joined the IRA. He didn't play any part in the Rising, from what I can gather. He was probably too young and maybe only not very long into the Fianna. And Belfast didn't play a significant role in the Rising, other than the fact that James Connolly, who was a Belfast man, as you all know, right, was the military leader of the Rising in 1916. So, but Joe didn't participate in the Rising in any way. It was really afterwards that he came into his role. And in fact, whenever the prisoners had been released from Frangach in Wales after the Rising, and all the Belfast ones returned back to Belfast, there was a ceilidh for them and a welcome home ceilidh in St Mary's Hall, which was a community hall, which was the centre of most Republican nationalist Irish activities, Irish dancing, Irish language, etc. There was a reception for them. And the young foreign tea that night was Joe McKelvey in his volunteer's uniform, who greeted them in 1917. And it was really after that he began to rise to the ranks of the IRA. And it was sometime the 3rd Northern Division of the IRA wasn't formed until well into the War of Independence, much later than all the other divisions. And that was because I think that back then Belfast was a very different place. Republicans were a minority of the minority. You know, West Belfast now is seen as a Republican stronghold, but back then it wasn't. De Valera had stood in the 1918 elections and had been heavily defeated by Joe Devlin, who received more than double his vote, right, and was re-elected as. So the sort of bourgeois nationalists were very much in the ascendancy at that point, and Republicans, militant republicanism, was a minority of that minority in the city, and in fact they were quite hostile to militant Republicans, and there was quite a physical and violent confrontation on occasion between, if you like, both sectors. But so eventually, I think Joe was also recruited into the IRB, that secret organisation within another secret organisation. Dennis McCulloch, who was a senior Republican in Belfast, an older senior Republican, was in fact the head, the supreme head of the IRB. And yet, when the rising was called, he knew nothing about it. He had been kept in the dark by Clark, McDonough, and Pearce, right, up until the very last, within days of the rising. Even though he was the supreme head of the IRB, they kept him in the dark and only informed him at the last minute. So Joe was recruited into the IRB, as were many, by Dennis McCulloch. So Collins, subsequently, whenever the treaty was signed, and you know, the reach of the IRB and the influence of the IRB was quite significant at that time, and that was one of the reasons, perhaps, why so many people in the Belfast Brigade and the leadership of the Northern Division did support the treaty. So anyway, so Joe, he became the OC of one of the battalions in Belfast. Then he became the Brigade OC. And then whenever, I think it wasn't until 1921, the 3rd Northern Division was actually established, he was appointed. And he was like most of the leaders at that time, not all of them, but most of them, he was a young man who, he wasn't an armchair general. He had participated in a significant number of operations. Whenever Thomas McCurtain was shot and killed in Cork, within a couple of days, the IRA in Belfast launched probably its first significant coordinated operation across the city. They attacked and burnt 3 of the main tax offices in Belfast in response to the killing of the mayor of Cork. And Joe participated in it, led it and participated. But also significantly, the connection between Cork and Belfast, and between Cork and McKelvey, really takes a life of its own at that point. Following the execution of McCurtain, of course, he was a close personal friend of Michael Collins. Collins set about trying to identify who was responsible for both the killing and giving the orders, more importantly. And they identified a detective inspector, Oswald Swansea. A good name, isn't it? Oswald Swansea. He's a Monaghan man. Friggin' Monaghan man. Any Monaghan men or women here? Right? He was obviously part of the aristocracy of Monaghan, a good Protestant Orange man. And whenever the inquest was held into the killing of McCurtain, he was named as the man who had given the order for McCurtain to be killed. And whenever that happened, he was immediately relocated out of the south and transferred to Lisburn, a very staunch loyalist and unionist town. All right, Patrick, there's a Monaghan man, to Lisburn. And the IRA in Belfast had a very significant intelligence network that Collins derived great benefit from, and they were able to track Swansea down to Lisburn fairly quickly. And then between Collins, McKelvey, who was the OC of the 3rd Northern Division, and a number of other key intelligence people in Belfast, they were able to identify that Swansea was based in Lisburn and was attending a church service every Sunday at 1 o'clock. Yeah? And the decision was taken to obviously execute Swansea in retaliation or revenge for the killing of McCurtain. And I just want to read a little bit about because it's a very significant event. And this comes from, there was two young Cork men come up, and 4 Belfast volunteers participated in the operation. And this is how it went. The active service unit that would carry out the operation comprised of 5 volunteers, 2 from Cork, Sean Culhane and Dick Murphy, and 3 Belfast volunteers, Roger McCorley, Tom Fox and Sean Leonard. Culhane, an intelligence officer, also knew Swansea by sight. I think this is a nice touch here. And in the hours before the operation, they were armed and briefed. Somewhat poetically, Culhane himself was armed with a revolver that belonged to his comrade Thomas McCurtain. So the weapon that fired the first shot that killed D.I. Swansea was Thomas McCurtain's handgun.
Oh.
At 1 p.m. on August 22nd, Swansea left the cathedral near Market Square, accompanied by 2 companions. As he passed the entrance to the northern bank, Culhane and Murphy approached from behind, and it was Culhane who fired the first shot from McCurtain's revolver to the side of Swansea's head, killing him instantly. Culhane, Murphy and McCorley, they weren't taking any chances, then shot Swansea several times as he lay on the ground. And Culhane recounts the operation. This is covered in the Bureau of Military Records in great detail, right, as you can imagine. They, McCorley and Fox, informed us that Swansea had gone to church and gave the approximate time the service would finish. We remained on the opposite side of the street near the church and made ourselves look as inconspicuous as possible, and took special care not to speak for fear our southern accents would betray us to any passers-by. Hark at 2 Cork men not stick out in Lisburn. We were not long waiting until the congregation started coming from the church. So when we observed Swansea and saw the direction he was taking, I gave the tip to Dick Murphy and we moved towards the corner. When he was only a few yards away from us, I said to Dick, "That's him." I fired the first shot, getting him in the head, and Dick fired almost simultaneously into his body. The 2 other volunteers, Roger McCorley and Tom Fox, provided armed cover during the operation. This was a predominantly loyalist town with a very busy town square, and the volunteers were acutely aware that they were surrounded by potential hostile passers-by who may try to intervene, and many of them did. The 4 of them made their escape, moving in pairs, firing in the air as they ran. The getaway vehicle driven by Sean Leonard was waiting with engine running outside the Technical College. McCorley later gave his own account of the shooting, and he says, "I was lost to leave the spot where Swansea fell, and as I delayed long enough to put another shot into him, the taxi started up before I reached it. But as he opened the door opposite to that on which I was running, I was forced to grab the handle of the door on my side, open the car, throw myself in, and I still had my finger on the trigger of my gun. And as I landed in the heap on the floor, I accidentally fired a shot in the car." But they got away. But it was Joe McKelvey who met them, took the weapons from the scene, and significantly, the 2 lads from Cork were immediately boarded the train for Dublin and for Cork eventually. And as the train was leaving Belfast, it passes Lisburn, and they could see the smoke of the fires as the first pogrom in Lisburn swept through Lisburn. Dozens of Catholic businesses and homes were set alight. Hundreds of Catholics and dozens of Catholic families were driven as refugees into Belfast. That month, as a consequence, over 7,000 workers in the Catholic workers in the shipyards were expelled. It was the single biggest event like that that occurred then and since. Maybe 7,000 Catholic workers expelled, brutally expelled, in response to the killing of Swansea. So McKelvey had overseen that, participated in it, and then after that, he also they had organised an attack on RIC barracks in Crossgar. Perhaps maybe 40 to 50 volunteers from Belfast, North Antrim, County Down attacked the barracks. They laid siege to it. They had blown a number of holes in the wall, poured petrol, and as was the case in many of the attacks upon the barracks. But they had to withdraw without taking the barracks. So McKelvey had participated in quite a number of very significant military operations. He had overseen, along with others, of course, the building of the 3rd Northern Division from a small battalion to a brigade to a division, which included not just Belfast, and by that point over 1,000 volunteers. Belfast had over 1,000 volunteers. I'm sure many of whom weren't particularly active, but also had extended division up into North Antrim and down into North Down as well. So I think that the people who worked with them, right, and knew the background, the personal history, the extent to which he and others, of course, not just by himself, had helped lead the IRA and directly participate, unlike some other leaders, in most of those operations, knew his value and knew his worth. But some probably didn't. And I remember coming across a quote. It's in Jimmy McDermott's book, The Northern Divisions. This is Collins said about Belfast and North. He said, "No other group of volunteers in Ireland have ever faced the odds and difficulties confronted by the IRA in the Northern capital. They were a minority within a minority, functioning within a very hostile environment. Unlike Cork or indeed Dublin or whatever, the majority, this very significant majority of the population of Belfast were loyalist and unionist, passionately loyalist and unionist. So the environment was very different. And of course, you also had a very bitter sectarian a war effectively taking place at the time, where communities like the Stewartstown or the markets, or Catholic communities up in Lower York Street, where Catholics had congregated. What had tended to happen, and what still happens occasionally, they would come under attack from loyalists, both armed and unarmed, including the RAC and the Specials, etc. So the IRA at that time had a very difficult job, in Belfast in particular, of trying to defend very vulnerable communities from attack. And so they didn't engage in the military operations, attacks upon the RAC, the auxiliaries or the Black and Tans to the same extent. That was because of the very difficult sectarian situation in Belfast. But anyway, so whenever obviously the truce was called, and our old friend Owen O'Duffy, one of the founding fathers of Fine Gael and our most prominent fascist, the founder of the Blue Shirts, was appointed the liaison officer for the IRA for the 6 counties. And McKelvey was appointed his assistant. And one of the significant things at the time was that the Unionists had been lobbying very strongly the British, the London government, not to include the North and not to include the Specials and etc. in the truce. Yeah? And in fairness, again, Collins, it would seem, took a strong stand and said it had to be an all-Ireland truce. And whatever recognition was given to the IRA and every other part of the country would have to be given in the North and in Belfast. And significantly, the B Specials, which was a huge victory for the IRA in Belfast, were stood down for that period. And that gave the IRA in Belfast a huge boost to its standing that it hadn't previously enjoyed, because here was a moment when people at least a lot saw that the IRA had significant influence and could make a significant difference, you know. So he was appointed, Joe was appointed assistant liaison officer, working with O'Duffy, and they worked at St Mary's. Again, it was as their HQ. They could wear a uniform, and they did, and they could carry sidearms. Ironically, during that period, there's a photograph of Joe on the Falls Road in his uniform, in that role at the time. The irony about that period as well is that the point about Collins's quote about, how difficult it was for the IRA in Belfast. Whenever the truce was called, and whatever reservations had about it, and the people had about it in Cork and other parts of the country, there was no doubt that it did provide a breathing space, a respite from raiding, arrests, imprisonment, extrajudicial killings, etc. The opposite was in Belfast. On the 11th of July, on the eve of the truce, Belfast experienced its first bloody Sunday. And the beef specialists on duty and off duty went on rampage across the city, and dozens of people were murdered as sectarian attacks escalated across the city. So on the one hand, in the south, the truce gave the IRA and the volunteers of the IRA some breathing space and respite. In the north, the conflict intensified, at least the sectarian conflict intensified. So what McKelvey had to deal with, what he had to lead, the circumstances in which he had to lead, and also during that period, there was a cat and mouse game between loyalist elements within the RAC. People may have heard about Detective Inspector Nixon and the Cromwell gang. They were a group of RAC and later RUC loyalists who embarked upon a campaign of assassination. In the dark of night, they would smash their way into homes. They're widely believed to be involved in the McMahon murders. It was a very infamous killing where a group of family and friends that ran a bar in North Belfast were assassinated. In fact, 5 or 6 of them were killed. So the IRA, and including Joe McKelvey, had to deal with that. And I think a lot of that has been lost at the significance, the leadership required by a young man in the very difficult circumstances. Says a lot about his qualities as a leader at the time, and the fact that he participated in some of those significant operations. But anyway, he ended up in Dublin after the treaty was signed, and he never returned to Belfast again. That was it. That was his. That was the last time he had set foot in Belfast. And he, out of most of the leadership, not all, but most of the leadership of the 3rd Northern Division, he opposed the treaty. And for that reason, he was repudiated by the key leadership figures, not by all of the volunteers, but by the key leadership figures. And he was replaced, I suppose, by Seamus Woods, who was a friend and a colleague of his. Although as far as the anti-treaty area were concerned, he was still the OC of the 3rd Northern Division. But he never returned to Belfast. And then, as I say, he seems to have developed a very strong and close relationship with the Mellows. There's a number of photographs with him during that period with Mellows. They spent a lot of time together, and they grew close. And not just in terms of friendship, but I also think in terms of politics, which is an interesting. What type of Republican was he? I think he was a left Republican, a socialist Republican, and I'll tell you why. But he became very close to Mellows. Also, coincidentally, when he was in the Fianna in Belfast was very heavily influenced by the Connolly daughters, by Ina and Nora, who were very active members of the Fianna at that time. In fact, the only women's Fianna Slua ever, right? The Betsy Gray Slua was formed in Belfast, about 50 young women in it. It's the only time it ever happened, and it never happened again. Right? But they came under the influence of Markievicz, Countess Markievicz, Cathal O'Shannon, who was a full-time official with Irish Transport and General Workers, a good close friend of Connolly, and Connolly himself. And in fact, I'm sure Joe would have met Connolly and been close. So I think that there's enough circumstantial evidence there to suggest that Joe McKelvey was a left Republican like Pater O'Donnell, like Liam Mellows, etc. And I think there's more evidence to support that. So during that period then, when between the signing of the treaty and the formal split, whenever the IRA, the anti-treaty IRA entered the four courts, again, McKelvey was there. When you read the Liam Mellows in particular, a book by Greaves, you can see in almost all of those key meetings, McKelvey participated. Yeah? But of course, the focus is on Mellows, so there's very little detail about what his contribution was. And then, of course, as we know, they ended up in the four courts after the formal split. And but interestingly, again, as a measure of them on, the IRA, the anti-treaty IRA, held its convention in the Mansion House. I'm trying to think of the date. Just before, a couple of months before, or maybe a couple of weeks before they went into the four courts, and Liam Lynch was elected the chief of staff of the anti-treaty IRA by popular vote at that convention. But what struck me was that Joe McKelvey was elected. He wasn't appointed. He was elected from the mass of the floor, from the volunteers, and appointed the assistant chief of staff. And anybody who knows how the IRA functioned then, or even closer to this current conflict, will know that conventions are a very democratic event. It's the grassroots active volunteers. So back then, whenever they gathered in the Mansion House, there was the 5 or 6 most popular people who were elected onto the Army executive were people like Liam Lynch, Liam Mellows, Ernie O'Malley, Seamus Robinson, etc. But also, second behind Liam Lynch, Joe McKelvey. And while these were volunteers who were seasoned fighters from Cork, Tipperary, Kerry, Dublin, etc., and it was those who chose McKelvey. And in terms of the votes, he came second behind Lynch. To me, again, it's another indication of his qualities as a leader that for some reason perhaps hasn't been recognised with history. Then the four courts, of course, he was a commandant, and if you know that little period in history, for a period, Lynch had sort of fallen out. Lynch and Mellows and O'Connor, etc., they had fallen out with Lynch. They thought Liam Lynch was a little bit too soft, wasn't militant enough, and for a day or so, there was a split. And Joe McKelvey became the acting chief of staff of the anti-treaty IRA for a brief period before they were reconciled again. And of course, we all know the story of the four courts. And whenever they were transferred to Mountjoy, McKelvey was again chosen to be the officer commanding the prisoners in Mountjoy, which again, if you understand the dynamics of prisons, and it's not just everybody is, they're not appointed from afar. It would have to been, you would have had to been someone who enjoyed the respect of those people and those prisoners. But also I think was interesting was he shared a cell with Liam Mellows, and whenever you read Pat O'Donnell's little booklet, I think it's And the Gates Flew Open, that he wrote about his time in Mountjoy and then in the Curragh, and he talks about sort of the evolution of the political ideas at that point. And Mellows, he adored Mellows. He obviously believed that Mellows was, was up there with Connolly, and believed that he was the leader who could have led the struggle against the counter-revolution. But McKelvey shared a cell with him. They were very, very close as friends. And whenever Mellows wrote notes from Mountjoy, which he sent out to the IRA, and he basically appealed to the IRA to adopt a socialist program. And what I discovered was that the notes from Mountjoy are almost a verbatim recounting of what had been published by the Communist Party of Ireland in their newspaper the previous month. Right? And there's circumstantial evidence, by the way, that both McKelvey and Mellows had applied to join the Communist Party of Ireland in 1922. Right? Did you know that? I have heard.
No.
I have heard. I choose to believe that. I think that's a wonderful thing to think. And when you consider that Mellows' notes from Mountjoy, if you read them, he talks about taking industry into public ownership, public utilities, etc., etc. It's a good old-fashioned James Connolly socialist program, right? And when you double back on the publications from that period from the CPI, it's identical to their program. Right? So I think there's some circumstantial evidence to support the fact that both Mellows and McKelvey were very strong left Republicans by the stage, and Patrick O'Donnell's view of what was going on among a core group of prisoners in Mountjoy at that time, led by Mellows. They were having debates, they were having discussions. Mellows was doing talks, etc. Tends to support that. Of course, then what happened? We're getting to the tragedy of the execution. I'm just going to maybe come to an end, and maybe we can, if people want to ask a few questions, right? One of the things that struck me about that period was in popular fiction, the anti-treaty IRA have been portrayed as the aggressors in the Civil War, right? And my reading and my studying of the Civil War has, to me, supported the opposite, right? That the people who were most ruthless, methodical, determined, were Collins and Mulcahy, right? F.S. Lyons, the famous historian, in his book said that at the height of the Civil War at one point, the Free State were recruiting as many 1,000 recruits a day, right? In the middle of the Civil War. They had received over 25,000 rifles from the British Army, artillery, heavy machine guns, millions of rounds of ammunition. It was to some extent, I think, Republicans like Liam Lynch and others who were reluctant to prosecute a guerrilla war against their former comrades. Whereas, and the reason why I mentioned that is because whenever the Civil War began, the IRA, the anti-treaty IRA, took many hundreds of pro-treaty IRA people, captured them, captured barracks, former British Army military bases, and they were treated with the utmost care. Liam Lynch was from what I can gather, a real old-fashioned soldier and gentleman. He believed in the rules of war and the Geneva Convention, and he was insistent that prisoners were treated because they were former comrades in particular. And it was the anti-treaty side, the pro-treaty side, that began to indulge in atrocities, where captured IRA volunteers were tortured, were summarily executed, ironically by some of their closest former comrades. Whenever that really came to a head, the Free State government in the middle of the Civil War decided to introduce military courts, as we know, and it decided to give the courts the power to execute anyone captured with arms. Almost immediately, 4 young volunteers in Dublin were arrested with weapons. They were executed almost immediately. Erskine Childers was executed on the 24th of November in Beggar's Bush, right? Ironically, for having a small handgun that Collins had given as a present when they were comrades before the split. So Liam Lynch issued an order that any TD who had voted for what they described as the murder bill, which was responsible for having Republicans executed, he eventually gave the order that any TD who had voted for that should be shot on sight. And not long after that order was issued, some IRA volunteers in Dublin shot and killed Sean Hales TD. He was and that night, by all accounts, the cabinet, the Free State cabinet, met in shock and panic as to what they would do. There was a fear that that perhaps even the Dáil wouldn't meet for fear of further killings, etc. And apparently, it was Mulcahy who proposed that 4 prominent prisoners be taken out and executed. And ironically, anybody who's into history will have seen this photograph. You know that one there of the wedding photograph of.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That's Cavan O'Higgins' wedding, and you can see on the right is best man Rory O'Connor, right?
Yeah.
And Mr. De Valera, right? And so Rory O'Connor was Cavan O'Higgins' best man. And in fact, I remember when reading into it, whenever they get married, there was a tradition, I believe, of giving the best man gold sovereigns as a little keepsake, right? And I am told that whenever O'Connor was executed, he had that coin on him. But so anyway, I'm just going to read to finish off just the execution myself. This is what drew me to it, I suppose, in the first place when I heard the story. In the dark hours of Friday evening, 8th of December, Joe McKelvey, Liam Mellows, Rory O'Connor and Dick Barrett were woken from their sleep by armed guards and the Deputy Governor, Pauline O'Keefe. They were told to dress and to pack their meagre belongings, but they were given no hint of what was to come. Joe paid his little collection of books into a pillowcase, including the Godfly, which is an interesting story, but I'll not get into it, and threw them over his shoulder as he left. Most likely, they believed that they were being moved to another part of the prison, or indeed another location. They didn't think, no one imagined that they would be taken out to be executed. And so they left the prison wing in the early hours of the morning, and the prison was quiet. There was no protest, nothing, hardly a thing was said. They were moved to another wing without any disturbance or commotion from the other prisoners, who, like Padre O'Donnell, continued to sleep through their removal. They were each placed in a cell alone. O'Keefe entered each in turn, handed each man a document which he informed them that they were to be shot at 8 a.m. in reprisal for the killing of Sean Hales. And each were read, "You, Joe McKelvey, are hereby notified that, being a person taken in arms against the government, you will be executed as reprisal for the assassination of Brigadier Sean Hales TD in Dublin on December 7th, etc., etc." Okay. And then they were given an opportunity to write their last letters to family and friends. Okay. And the interesting thing about the execution, I suppose, I've been told that part of the film, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, and the relationship between the brothers is partly based upon the Hales. Sean Hales, who was killed in Dublin, his brother was the OC of the anti-treaty IRA in Cork, or part of Cork, right? Etc. Right? So you had this situation where less than a year previously, when O'Higgins was being married, his best man was Rory O'Connor. And when the warrants for their execution were signed, they had to be signed by the Minister for Justice, who was Cavan O'Higgins. Right? So Cavan O'Higgins sent Rory O'Connor and the other 3 lads to the firing squad. And what happened was they faced a firing squad of 24 soldiers. I know you wondered about how the firing squads work. When you think about it, 4 guys, they lined the 4 of them up together. As they walked out into the yard, Dick Barrett sang a song. Maybe it's famous in Cork. Maybe some of the Cork people could say the old Cork Road. So while he was blindfolded, and Mellows shouted out. This came from, by the way, a pro-Free State priest who was in attendance at the execution. So it didn't come from Republicans, right? It came from someone who had no axe to grind against the Free Staters. So because it was 4 of them, 6 each of the firing party were given a target. So 6 of them were told to fire on Rory O'Connor, 6 on, and so on and so on. And apparently Rory O'Connor was the most famous of the 4 at the time, whatever about Mellows subsequently. Rory O'Connor was the most infamous at the time. The Irish Times and others had made him out to be like a rabid dog, crazy Republican and all this type of shit. The firing squad was led by 2 officers. One of them was the nephew of Owen McNeill, the great granduncle of Michael. Michael McDowell's great uncle. No surprises there, right? Really. But the second officer in charge was a guy called Hugh Gunn, and he was a close friend and comrade of McKelvey from Belfast, who had went south, supported the treaty, and joined the Free State Army. So when the order was given to fire, for some reason, despite their orders, most of them fired on Rory O'Connor, and he was shot that many times his clothes burst into flames. This is true, Bill. This is a fact. Crazy. Joe McKelvey was only wounded and was conscious, right, and cried out a number of times, "For God's sake, finish me off." Right? As I say, remember, this is recounted by a priest who was in attendance, who was pro-treaty. He only told this story many years later, right? And it's documented. And apparently the firing squad and the officers in charge went into a panic because it was a fucking disaster. Excuse the French, folks. It was an absolute, everything that could have went wrong, right? Literally, not to be macabre about this.
Yeah.
Rory O'Connor's body was in flames, right? Because he was shot that many times from the strikes, right? And McKelvey was moaning and groaning and saying, "Finish me off." Eventually, McNeill got a hold of himself, apparently, after running about like a headless chicken for a minute or so, right? And gave the lads a coup de grace, a single shot or more to the head, and killed him, And it to me, that execution sums up more than any the absolute tragedy of that period, and how people who were once brothers, Kevin O'Higgins, Rory O'Connor, would end up on opposite sides of such a terrible conflict. But I'll end on this little note, right?
Of course.
And this little note, right? At the end of the Civil War, the Free State government had executed 77 IRA volunteers. Many more than the British ever did during the War of Independence, right? And I think it was and it was Kevin O'Higgins who, as the Minister for Justice, signed most, if not all, of those warrants. And then later he most famously or infamously said, 77, yes, and 777 more if need be. Right?
Yeah.
He was a passionate advocate of the I suppose the fascist attack upon his former comrades in the area. Of course, then in 1927, as Mr. O'Higgins left his home in leafy suburbs of Dublin, a car coincidentally was driving by, and in that car were a number of IRA volunteers, including in it, if you could just bear with me, was one young guy who had been in jail with Mellows and McKelvey, right? And this wasn't planned. They saw O'Higgins walking to church. They swerved back, jumped out of the car, and shot O'Higgins. And the lad who had been a friend, Gannon, you called him, that's his name was Gannon, sorry. He said, seeing him, we were just taken over and incensed with hatred. You could have no idea what it was like with the memory of the executions and the sight of him just walking along on his own. We started shooting from the car, then getting out of the car, we continued to shoot. We all shot him. He didn't have a chance, and O'Higgins died a few hours later. And in that little chapter I had at the top of the chapter, on wrongs, sweet vengeance waits. Sinai.
Oh, that's
Right.
brilliant. That was brilliant, Jim. I really enjoyed that. I thought that your account...
I went on too long, by the way. I know
No, you
I went on
didn't.
too long.
No, you didn't. I mean, I got loads of questions for you too. I thought the account, though, of the executions in particular was very, very powerful, you know. Okay, so let's ask you a few questions.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, what happened in the northern pogroms?
Yeah. Well, probably the most vicious pogroms that swept across Belfast ever, right? From early days right through the present day, around not 1969, as bad as they were, was the pogrom that swept across Belfast from Lisburn after the execution of D.I. Swansea in Lisburn. There was an unprecedented attack upon Catholic communities across Belfast. And you got to remember back then that the Catholic community was much smaller than it was, or than it is now, for example. You, of course, had by then effectively the RUC, the B Specials had been formed. The British Army were on the streets, of course, but the Loyalists were armed in a way that is unimaginable now, and were free to attack vulnerable Catholic communities in a way that you just couldn't possibly imagine today. And when you think of it, 7,000 Catholics were expelled from the shipyards during that month following the execution of Swansea. 7,000. And when we say expelled, they weren't told, right, guys, you're going to have to head on home here. You know, Catholics were in many cases beaten, some cases killed, brutally expelled from their jobs, violently expelled from their jobs. And yeah, the pogroms were absolutely vicious and dreadful, and were predominantly directed at the Irish Nationalist Catholic community as opposed to the other way around. There were some sectarian attacks that emanated from the Republican and Nationalists. There's no doubt about that. But 90% of them emanated from within hardline loyalism.
Okay. Here's the statement from Thomas Duggan. Jim, I don't think Joe McKelvey was fully aware of the danger of the violent sectarian attacks on the people. A loyalist crowd gathered in Cupar Street to attack the Falls area. My dad asked him to get some gear to defend the area. McKelvey refused, quoting, "We don't do fratricide," i.e. kill our fellow Irishmen. My dad did what he deemed necessary and scattered the loyalist crowd. He was court-martialed by McKelvey and demoted from section leader. And the Young Guns, as they were known, revolted. Joe was replaced by a Belfast man, and Joe was deployed to GHQ in Dublin. Okay,
well, it's an interesting debate, you know.
Yeah.
And as a Republican, and as someone who obviously historically previously had been involved in the current conflict in the area, it's an element of our history that I think we have to face up to. That there was a sectarian element, and I'm not saying that fellow's father was, right?
Oh, I know, yeah.
But there was a sectarian element within the IRA in Belfast. People under those type of conditions did want to respond and retaliate and attack indiscriminately Protestants, right, in retaliation, right? And unfortunately, I think some people in the IRA, including the OC of the IRA who replaced McKelvey, was a guy called Roger McCorley. And I think what I've learned about McCorley was that he sanctioned a number of reprisals, sectarian reprisals. But that's wrong. That's not the answer. Never was the answer. Never will be the answer. Yes, disciplined violence directed at members of the RIC, the RUC, the B Specials, the auxiliaries, the Black and Tans, but indiscriminately throwing grenades into trams, taking workers to the shipyards because they're all Protestants, that is sectarian, right? And we shouldn't shy away from the fact. Now, McKelvey, ironically, from what I agree, McKelvey was very anti-sectarian, right? Very, very disciplined and very, very determined to prevent random, indiscriminate sectarian attacks upon Protestants.
Yeah.
And I agree with that.
Okay. Mick Nugent has asked, was it true? Sorry?
All right, Mick, I know Mick.
All right. Was it true Charles Haughey's father was a liaison officer as well with the Northern IRA to Michael Collins?
I don't know. Is the honest answer. I really don't know if he was or wasn't. But the interesting thing about that period is, you wonder, because you ask the question yourself, how is it that the people who were most disadvantaged by the treaty and partition supported the fucking treaty? Excuse again the French. But I think it was because when you look at it now, they were influenced by Collins.
Yeah.
They were influenced by the IRB. The IRB were well organised in Belfast within the IRA. Okay? Collins promised them significant weapons, modern weapons on a scale and on a level. So was this out nodding the wink? No, Collins was very good at saying one thing and doing another.
Yeah,
right?
Working the treaty.
So working parts of the treaty. I no doubt that the cute her, the country cute her sort of attitude, right, Mick? Right?
Yeah.
I think Collins persuaded people and said, look, listen, we'll give you all the gear you need. Yeah. The IRA had very little gear in Belfast, even less in the rest of the parts of the country. And also what shouldn't be forgotten is that people were given jobs and given a wage in the new Free State Army. Don't underestimate the importance of job security, jobs and money for their families that they'd never enjoyed because of unemployment and discrimination in Belfast. And during that period, Collins set up a paid, if you like, Republican police. And there was about 70 Republicans employed, paid every week by Collins and the pro-treaty. So all those things taken together, they believe Collins is when he said we're gonna launch a campaign and we're gonna undermine the new state of Northern Ireland, and the Border Commission will rule against it and blah blah blah. But they were duped, of course, and many of them realised years later that they were duped.
Well, that's interesting. That leads me to the next question nicely. Was the fact that many in the North went pro-treaty while McKelvey went anti-treaty the reason that McKelvey isn't given as much recognition as others around this period, or what do you think?
Yes, I think that's part of the reason. I think that, to me, there's three or four. One is that, ironically, a couple of comments, and you can't underestimate the comment that Rory O'Connor makes in his book about, he was just a token Northerner. I think that set a tone in how other people viewed McKelvey, which wasn't right, wasn't correct. And because McKelvey wasn't an intellectual who recorded his diaries and stuff like that, like O'Malley in some respects, we had no real record of his ideology and his thoughts and stuff. But when you look at his history, and I was saying to yourself before we come on, look at his role in one of the most significant killings of that period, the execution of D.I. Swansea in Lisburn. Yeah. He planned it, he participated in it. It was one of the most successful, I suppose, revenge attacks or retaliation attacks. The attack upon the army, the RIC base in Crosscar by dozens of IRA volunteers. And there's a whole series of things that McKelvey was involved in. And I was saying to yourself, I read some of the statements that Roger McCorley, who was one of the pro-treaty officers who became the OC of the IRA after McKelvey in Belfast. And when he tells the story of the attack in Crosscar, he hardly mentions Joe McKelvey.
Really?
Even though Joe McKelvey was in charge of the operation.
Yeah.
He was in charge. He was directing the IRA force that was attacking the barracks at that time. And yet when it came to retelling the story, he wrote him out of it. Right? No. So I think there was an element within the pro-treaty IRA who were, in some respects, shamed by McKelvey and what happened to him. And then what happened subsequently, most of the guys who supported the treaty, ironically, some of them were involved in atrocities against former comrades in the South. McCorley's brother, Felix McCorley, was an officer in was responsible for the summary execution of an unarmed captured IRA volunteer, and I think possibly Wexford or Wicklow, right? So the bitterness on that side, ironically, was much more significant than anything it ever generated on the anti-treaty side. So I think those combination of factors, he was a northerner, the comments by Ernie O'Malley, they're writing out of history, and then just to focus on the big guns like Liam Mellows and Liam Lynch. But I think he was much more significant than anybody gave him credit for. And I think he was a very central player in all of those big moves and developments during that period.
Sure. Cleo has a question for you. I suppose more your opinion on this. He was so young to have had so much responsibility. Could you compare his qualities to any modern day leader?
Any modern day leader? Well, I think had he lived, Martin McGuinness, someone like that, came from a working class background, rose up through the ranks of the IRA, was an active volunteer, participated in operations, but was also, I think McKelvey was a left Republican without a doubt, was very close to Mellows. I think when Mellows sent out his notes from Mountjoy, which was a very significant development at the time. Of course, Liam Lynch ignored the notes because he was a great guy, but he was a militarist. He saw things in terms of men, weapons, battles and actions, as opposed to the politics and the strategic stuff. And of course, Dave Valera was a little Irish right-wing Tory, right? And he had no interest in socialism, right? So, but I think that Mellows and anybody who's been in prison and shared a cell with someone else, right? Yeah. And they could have not. Then they didn't have to be in the cell together. They chose to be in the cell together, right? Yeah. So I think that Mellows' notes from Mountjoy reflects McKelvey's politics also, and that was a joint. If you're in a cell together, you know, it's just that he wasn't the I suppose the ideological figure that Mellows was, or the intellectual figure. But I think he was significant. He was a left Republican, a leader with enormous qualities, and he hasn't been given the recognition he deserves.
You mentioned about this earlier. This is really interesting about, you know, the communist kind of leanings of Mellows and McKelvey. But were the men that they were in charge of, did they have similar viewpoints as them, or were they out on their own, or what was it?
Well, not all of them, of course, but I mean, when you read about, I would recommend people read "And the Gates Flew Open" by Peter O'Donnell. It's his memoir of his time in Mountjoy and in the Curragh during that period, and he talks about how there was a small circle of leaders in Mountjoy at the time, led by Mellows, and they, during that period, they didn't just sit on their arses and think about what was happening on the outside. They were talking, they were debating, they were having classes, they were having lectures. Yeah. And Mellows was very much in the tradition of Connolly. Mellows was a very close to Connolly. He was a protege of Connolly from very, very early days. And he was a very deep thinker. And there was a little circle of those people who were, and it's just, the same happened in this conflict during in the Hitch blocks or in Armagh prison or later in McGabry, where prison becomes a place where people debate and discuss and learn and reflect and criticize. And there was a process like that going on in Mountjoy. Yeah? Of course, not everybody would have been interested in it. I'm sure plenty of them told them to fuck off. I have no interest in going to classes. I want to sit in my cell and do fuck all. There's always an element that don't want to do nothing. Right? But if you read O'Donnell's memoirs of that period, there was a very active debate about politics and strategy and what needed to be done. And the notes from Mountjoy reflect, I suppose, that development that they came out of it. And there is evidence to suggest, I wasn't just joking, people made realize, of course, in 1922, the Communist Party of Ireland had been formed.
That's right, yeah.
About a year or so previous, I'm not too sure the exact time. Literally, there is no secret about this. the notes from Mountjoy are almost verbatim lifted from the CPI programme that had been published a number of months earlier in their paper, whatever that was called. And there is some evidence to suggest that they were in the process of joining the Communist Party of Ireland. Right? So, because it was it's burning main, it was new, and it, it didn't have the, it didn't have the sort of the connotations that it had then later with the communist scars and the red scars and all that type of stuff. But that was probably the first example. Whenever the notes from Mountjoy were captured by the Free State, they were published in the Times, right, under the headlines of communist conspiracy and communist this and communist that. It was probably the first example of what these sort of McCarthyite red scars were, anti-communist sentiment is whipped up by the Catholics and the bishops and the priests, and that was probably the first example of it.
Okay. You mentioned this before the talk. Okay, I'd like you maybe to mention it again. After Collins died, were the Free State interested in helping the North or not?
Not. It was embarrassing the speed with which all of the other main protagonists on the pro-treaty side ditched any pretense, right, of launching, for example, any campaign in the North, providing weapons to the pro-treaty IRA. As soon as Collins died, Mulcahy and others, who was the first Taoiseach? What do you call the guy?
From you're talking Arthur Grave. Oh, W.T. Cosgrave, you mean?
Cosgrave.
Yeah.
Cosgrave couldn't wait to ditch it. Like, it was unseemly. It was actually that quick. It was unseemly, right? And they made no secret of it. They just said, right, listen, forget about that. It's not happening. We don't give a fuck about the North. Let's concentrate on building this little conservative state in the South. And of course, Cavan O'Higgins famously, I've quoted in a few wee things I've done. Cavan O'Higgins famously said that we were some of the most conservative people ever to put
revolutionaries ever, yeah.
And that was very true of that cabal that was left to build the Free State. They were very, very conservative, glad to ditch the North, and had the status interest.
Okay, Steve McCracken. Steve McCracken, a great talk. Looking forward to listening back. Liam O'Sullivan, I found James' assessment of Michael Collins and Eamon De Valera before the start very interesting. Would Jim mind expanding on this? My interpretation of his comments was that Collins wouldn't ever have left the North behind, but that De Valera did. Would he like to expand on this comment?
Well, yes, I would like to, actually, because I think Collins is I always be very surprised when Republicans, militant Republicans, right, eulogize Collins. Right? And yes, on the one hand, Collins had a genuine affection and concern for Northern nationalists and Catholics. But he and Griffiths signed the treaty and drove the treaty home, knowing that the consequence was not only the split in the movement and the country, but the partition. Right? So on the one hand, yes, he had a concern, and I think if he had lived, he would have continued to be the couture. Say one thing, he probably would have continued to maybe arm pro-treaty Republicans in Belfast for the defence, and he was the type of guy clearly who did stand up to the British and to the Unionists in relation to the treatment of nationalists and Catholics in the new Northern state. There's no question about that. But having said that, I'm always struck by the fact that had Connolly lived, here's the conundrum. Had Connolly lived and had Collins lived, and you remember Collins said that his greatest admiration was for James Connolly.
Yeah, that's right. He'd follow him into hell, I think he said. Yeah.
Yeah. But isn't the irony? The irony is that had Collins lived, he probably would have had James Connolly executed.
Yeah, he's playing the politician, I think, with that quote.
I firmly believe that because after Collins died, and within months, all of his colleagues had Connolly's protege executed, Liam Mellows. And there is a belief, there is a theory that one of the main reasons why the four were executed was to execute Liam Mellows, because he was probably the most. He offered the greatest rallying political, ideological point for the anti-treaty side, and they wanted to remove him from the scene. But I always find that right. I think Collins, had he lived, the inevitable consequence, he would have prosecuted the Civil War in order to defeat the anti-treaty IRA. And he, like others, would have executed those people who were opposed to that treaty. And if they would have executed Liam Mellows, they would have executed James Connolly. So had he lived, had they both lived, well, maybe the whole thing would have happened different if Connolly had been alive. But had they both lived and had the events unfolded in a similar fashion, I think Collins would have almost certainly had James Connolly executed.
Okay.
Like any good counter-revolutionary.
There's always a split afterwards, yeah. Paddy Campbell, great talk, Jim. Why would Dennis McCullough have been kept in the dark about the Rising if he was Supreme Commander of the IRB?
Well, that's a good question. Well, now, but like we all sort of know now that Tom Clark and Sean McDermott were the key. I didn't even realise this. How important McDermott was in the preparations for the Rising. I'd always thought about Pearce and obviously Tom Clark, but actually probably Sean McDermott played a greater role in organising and preparing for the Rising than Pearce did over that longer period of time, because he was a close confidant of Clark, so I just think the centre of gravity moved to Dublin.
It's interesting you say that, though, because McDermott was in the Dungannon clubs with McCullough in the beginning, so
yeah, he was, but then he moved. Yeah. Obviously, he moved south, and they also had a bit of a fallout with Bulmer Hodgson and people like that who were central. So I don't know whether it was personal or security, or probably a little bit of both, right? Where they had decided to keep it very, very tight among a small number. Clark, McDermott in the early stages, then Pearce, and then, as we know, Connolly was brought in at the last. So I just think it was for security reasons. And then ironically, if you had Daniel's book, when you read his book, and he deals with that period as well, is that that's one of the reasons why the Rising was able to take place, because the castle didn't know about the Rising, and it was because it was kept tight.
Okay, we just have 3 or 4 more questions, if that's okay.
Yep.
I'll tell you, you're getting a lot of great responses here as well. Let's see. Yeah.
By the way, that's my lockdown beard. I don't normally have a beard.
Join the club.
That's my lockdown beard.
Why pick?
I don't look as old as this in real life.
Why pick Joe McKelvey to be executed? Was it because of his rank or where he was from? The way the argument is the 4 provinces of Ireland, or?
Well, it's only speculation. Who knows why? But whenever McKelvey brought the proposition to the cabinet, it meant he supposedly, and there's some record of this from some of the people who attended that meeting, that he proposed that 4 prominent Republicans from the 4 provinces be, and he named the names, right? And it was his proposal, his idea. So I presume, there must have been, an element which was about the 4 provinces. But I do think that Dick Barrett, Richard Barrett, wasn't as prominent. even though he was a leading. No, I'm just saying as a fact, he wasn't as well known as Rory O'Connor, or Liam Mellows, right? And you could say, well, why was he picked? He was a Cork man, all that type of stuff, but he wasn't as senior as, say, Mellows and O'Connor, right? So it's hard to know. Maybe there was an element of the four provinces and, you know, personal animosity too. But I do think Mellows was the main target.
Cleo has the best comment of the evening. Both of our beards look fab. Thank you, Cleo. What was I going to ask you? Is there any evidence that attempts were made to protect the then Public Record Office, or is the destruction of the records the inevitable consequence of the attack on the four courts? Well, we gave a talk on that on Friday, actually.
I honestly don't know. You know.
No, that's okay. Well, we have got a video up on YouTube about the archives. It was only done on Friday, so it's only just gone up. If you want to check that out.
That's the trouble with military men.
What?
In many cases, they have a very limited vision, right?
Oh yeah.
And I remember this. I was in prison at the time, and in the IRA, right? At the time, right?
Yeah.
When the IRA was carrying out a firebomb campaign in Belfast City Centre, they had tried to plant a cassette bomb in a store, and because of security, they couldn't get in. And the young IRA volunteer planted it instead in the Linden Hall Library.
Oh, and that's with 1798. Thomas Russ. Oh, geez.
Yeah, the epicenter of the unity of Catholic Protestant dissent and Enlightenment.
And Mayo there's a Muir Hall as well, you know, like John Muir, you know.
That's the difficulty with military people, you know, that they don't often think about or sometimes think about the value of artifacts and blah blah blah. Just blow it up, burn it down, kill everybody. That's what, you know.
Okay.
That's what happens when militarists are in charge of.
Liam's asked, why does James think this story has been largely forgotten when compared to similar martyrs in the southern counties?
Well, like Seamus Robinson, there's each one has a particular set of reasons. You know, so Robinson, as Daniel said, was written out by because of parochialism, probably. Yeah. Don Breen, and his huge ego, right? And same with McKelvey. I think, you know, a series of things. His colleagues downplayed his role. His pro-treaty colleagues downplayed his role. And when the history was written, he was very deliberately written out of it by many of his former comrades. You know, and because he didn't, you know, because he wasn't a great diarist. And remember, like, so why is Ernie O'Malley so famous now? Because he was a great diarist. He kept a record, but he certainly was able to write in great detail about his memoirs. Otherwise, we might not have heard very much about Ernie O'Malley. But McKelvey wasn't. So those people who weren't meticulous about keeping records or maybe writing something, you know.
I'm just going to read out.
Mellows was an intellectual as well as an activist and a leader, you know. Okay,
I'm just going to read out a few comments and then ask you one question at the end. There's loads of questions, but we'd be here all night otherwise. Brilliant talk from Minota. Excellent from John. Excellent talk from Una. Excellent lecture, Mila Bukas. Really interesting. Thank you. Awful account of the reprisal shooting. It was shocking. It was a great lecture. War has rarely brought out the best in people. Let's see. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Great talk. Thanks, Jim and Marcus. Brilliant talk, Mila Bukas. Now, what I wanted to ask you is, what kind of person do you think Joe McKelvey was like?
He was very well educated, ironically. His mother was a very independent, well-educated woman. She was a postmistress. Mightn't seem like very much now, but in Stewartstown, it was a I suppose strong economic place to be for a woman at that time. To be running the post office, which was probably the heart of the town. His grandfather was called. His mother's name was Rose O'Neill, right? And his grandfather was called Q O'Neill. And of course, you know the significance of Q O'Neill.
Oh, yeah, absolutely,
right?
yeah.
Right. And his grandfather was a scholar and a teacher and a very well read, and he had his own school before education became, I suppose, a public provision. People had to pay to go to school, and you had your head school. So I think he was well educated, a sense of history, anti-sectarian, right? Left, progressive, socialist, and a doer, not an armchair general, but someone who led from the front. But he wasn't a writer, and he didn't leave much of his thoughts on paper for us, and that's part of the reason why he's sort of been neglected. But he's only 24, and I think he was engaged. There's a bit of speculation about that. He had a girlfriend called Cassie O'Hara, and there's a little mentioned in the book. According to one of the accounts I came across, he made her a ring from a coin in Mountjoy. And like Cross would have been in every prison in every period in history. He made her an engagement ring, I'm told, from a coin. It was hammered out and shaped and sent it out to her. And she never married. She herself became a leading Republican all of her days, right?
Yeah.
Was interned in the 40s during the emergency years, and she was on hunger strike, etc., and remained, never married, never had any children, and there's probably a great love story in there somewhere too.
And if people are interested in getting your book, where can they get it?
Well, they could probably get it. It's actually out of print now, but you get copies in the art shop on the Falls Road, and you'll get them from the Connolly Centre if you go to our www.rsucanila.com in the Connolly Centre, and you can get them there. But my title of the book is called Goodbye, Dearest Heart, and that's a little line. That's where he ended his letter to his mother. He said to his mother, "Goodbye, dearest heart, my dearest heart." That's what he said to his mother. Isn't that heartbreaking?
It really is, yeah. I have to say, your talk tonight was absolutely enthralling. I absolutely loved it. I had about 10 other questions. I just thought, give this man a rest. Honest to God. And you can see from the comments below, absolutely fantastic what's been said. I'll definitely be coming to check.
Look at the photograph of him. Look at how good looking he was too.
Yeah.
So you asked me what type of guy he was. He was a handsome young fella.
Didn't have our beards though, but yeah.
Yeah. A good man in uniform.
Listen, take care of yourself, Jim, and thanks a million. Really appreciate
it. All the best, folks.
All the best. Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.